it is Tiki Technical Tuesday, and this episode is all about these fellows, the little glaze testers that I use in the studio. Now, these are not what we're really talking about today. We're talking about the mold I made these little fellows with. I made this mold, oh my God, before the pandemic. So 3 years ago, at a mold making class here in Eugene, taught by Georgie Ceramics. The teacher was Brett Binford from Mud Sharks in Portland. And it was an incredible class, and I ended up with this incredible mold. But as you know, if you have watched Tiki Technical Tuesday, molds don't last forever. I got about 70 castings out of this mold, but in recent castings, I have noticed that the surface is kind of pitted. There's been a lot of like little pinholes in the surface, and just overall, the mold is just getting tired. The details are getting soft. Think of the mold like a bar of soap. The more you use it, the softer the details get. Slip is abrasive, and the chemicals in it will attack the plaster. So I need a new mold. Also, this is my only mold, so if I was to drop this mold, I'd be out of luck. So not only do I want to make a fresh new mold, I want to make a silicone mold of that mold so I can make many more molds. Plus, I'm excited about this because this is a small mold, and small molds, believe it or not, are a little different to make than big molds. But before we get into the differences of the molds, let's talk about why I decided to make a mold of this little toy. I love these little guys for two reasons. One, their shape. It's a cool shape. They capture a lot of details. They have fine lines and recesses and an interesting overall shape. So the glaze flows on them, and they're a good analog or replacement or model for a lot of the like sculpted tiki mugs that I make. The other reason I love using a plastic toy like this for tests is the undercuts are already mostly figured out for you. What do I mean by that? Well, I think I better do like a graphic explaining undercuts. Okay, undercuts are a bit tricky, so I'm going to do some graphics that will hopefully help you to understand the basic concept. Now, this is for a rigid object and a rigid mold, like a plaster mold. Now, when you're making rigid molds, it's critical that they never pass behind the object. Now, if you have a simple object like this round sphere, I like to look at the center line. If we make the mold and the mold passes the center line, see that right there? Those are undercuts. And if we try to open the mold like this, it's going to break just like this. Now, if we make a mold and follow the center line exactly on the symmetrical shape, check it out. It's going to open up nice and clean with no problems. Now, not every object is perfectly symmetrical like this sphere. Let's take a look at kind of a weird shape. Now, we can technically find a center line on this where each side is symmetrical, but if we were to do that, take a look at these spots right here. These are undercuts, and you guessed it, if we tried to open the mold, it's also going to break at these points. Now, if we take a step back, ignore the center line and just consider what is the best way for these two halves to move apart from each other without catching or moving behind the model. This looks like a good spot, and check it out. The mold opens up nice and clean with no undercuts. So now you know what undercuts are and why we should avoid them, and that is why I love using simple hard plastic toys like this one, because the mold makers already figured out where all the undercuts are, and all you need to do is follow the seam line in the toy when you make your mold. Now, maybe you're saying, but I don't have a little Kaiju Booska toy. Chances are you do have a McDonald's toy in your house, or perhaps you could go to like a dollar store anytime you see a simple hard plastic toy like this. Now, it's critical that it is a hard plastic toy, and it's also critical that it has one seam line in it. So you want to look along the sides and just see that this was actually two pieces of plastic assembled like this. Now, don't worry if there's a little cap on the feet, because that's going to be where we pour the slip in. You just want a two-piece thing. Do not think that any small toy will do. For example, this little fellow will not work. Even though it's a small, simple-looking toy, the giveaway is it's made out of vinyl. It is a soft toy. That means that they avoided undercuts by using a flexible material that let them pop them out without breaking pieces. So if you look really closely at the surface, you'll see that there are actually a lot of undercuts on it. So you want to make sure that whatever model you select, It's rigid, and therefore you can just follow the one simple parting line that's already been figured out by the toy makers. Now, I do want to say something really quick about copyright. Do not run out and grab a McDonald's toy and think I'm saying it's okay to mold it and sell it. I am not selling any of these. I do not own the right to Kaiju Booska. This is primarily for my own personal use, and I would never sell it. That's infringing on another artist's work, and that is never okay. Do not come at me with the, oh, but McDonald's is a big corporation. They won't get hurt if I resell their toys or whatnot. Every corporation is made of people and artists and people just like you and me. And I mean, people would call me a corporation because I am legally a company, but that doesn't make it okay to steal from me. Just don't do it. Taking copyright material is theft. Never do it. But if you're going to do it for your own use, for your own reference, that's completely fine. And it's great practice for mold making and great reference for glaze testing. All right, it's time to make that mold. We are going to be making a two-piece mold, and we are going to take advantage of the seam line already figured out on this toy. Look at it, it's perfect. Very easy for us to follow. The other thing I've got to keep in mind is this was originally a coin bank, so I want to cover that little coin slot with a plastic kind of clear piece of tape here, just to make sure that plaster doesn't find its way inside of my toy. Every mold begins with careful measuring. What we want to do is figure out just how big this mold is going to be so we can make our mold boxes. Now I'm allowing for about 1 inch of plaster, maybe even 1.5 inches of plaster around my model. That gives enough plaster for the wicking action, the essential thing to happen when you're slip casting. If you want to learn more about that, you can go and watch my How Slip Casting Works video, but just keep in mind you're going to need at least a minimum of 1 inch around your model. So since our mold is only going to be 4.5 by 5 inches, that brings us to the first big change in making big molds versus tiny molds, and that is just the weight of the plaster. When I'm pouring a giant mold like this mold for the hornbill, there's a lot of hydraulic pressure from all of that plaster. So when we make the walls, I usually use wood cottle boards because you need something very strong like the wood to hold back the weight of this plaster. Now, our mold is going to be small, I mean, roughly this size, the size of our original glaze testing mold. So to make the walls for this, I'm going to use a much lighter and simpler material, foam core. I get foam core in the studio in these kind of big 4-foot sheets, so I cut them down using straight edges and X-Acto knives. Always get a fresh X-Acto knife blade when you're cutting up foam core. And the first thing I want to worry about is the base of the mold. And this is going to be put together using the dimensions that we got while carefully measuring our model. I've got my base all set up. This is very similar to that mold chair thing that I would build if you've watched my past mold making episodes. But I'm not so worried about the like this face at all. I'm really just focused on setting up what will be the footprint for our mold right here and a little kind of extra working table. You'll see how I use this later. And I put a center line in there so we know where to line up our little fellow. So I think we're ready to just get started on what is the second big difference from the way that I make these molds when I make big molds. When I make big molds, I usually use a water-based clay to set up my mold walls. Since this is small, we're going to use something a little bit different. Now, I like to use this because, one, it doesn't dry out. The water-based clay, when you're making a big mold, there's a lot of the clay there, so it dries out very slowly. But we're doing a very small piece, so there's not a lot of clay there, and it will dry out very fast, which will drive me bananas. And two, I'm going to be working in some very delicate little areas. It's just when you're working smaller, you want to have a little bit more control, and that's why I like to use the oil-based clay. So what we're doing here is building up a mold wall. I set down a bed of clay, press my model into it, and then slowly lift that bed of clay up to the level of that mold line that's already kind of baked into this model. Remember, this plastic model has a seam running around the edge, so I'm going to follow that seam exactly. It's my roadmap for where to put the parting lines on this two-piece mold. Once the mold wall is done, it's time to figure out how tall to make this face of the mold. Now remember, I want this to be about 1 inch away from the model, and the nose kind of adds a little bit, so maybe 3 1/4. 3 1/4 looks good. We're going to go with that. So we hop back onto the foam core, and I cut out a strip that is going to be 3 1/4 inches tall, and then I'm going to mark out each one of my wall dimensions. That's 4.5 inches, and then 5 inches, then 4.5 inches, and then 5 inches. So I've got the sidewall cut out, or at least measured out. And this is the critical thing. This is a little trick that I learned way back when in my special effects days. I learned this from a fellow named Rob Henderstein. He makes eyeballs. And instead of cutting out wall number 1 at 5 inches, then 4.5, 5, 4.5, you only want to cut the first layer of the foam core. And we're going to make a hinge that'll let us wrap this into a perfect box instead of having to hot glue together 4 pieces. It works super well. It's one of my favorite little tricks. And I also, at the very end, added, 3/16, the width of foam core. So I will have a little tab that I can glue in that final piece. You'll see, it'll make sense. One second, here we go. Not all the way through. You ready for this? And there it is. Now I know which, wait, where's my little extra bit? Oh yeah, there it is. There we go. Perfect little box. Isn't that amazing? Look at how well these hinges work. So much easier than messing with 4 individual pieces for the sides. At this point, I realized I had forgotten to put mold release on the model before we mold it. So I'm using Murphy's oil soap. You can use any, I just like to use mold soap for this. It's a very simple process. You just brush on a thin coat with a fine brush and then buff it away with a clean rag. I did this twice, so I put 2 coats on there, and you know you're done when the surface feels nice and just slick and polished. Once we've got the release on, it's time to hot glue our foam core mold box down. So I run a bead of hot glue around the base and then just press that hinged frame that we made around the top. I hold it till it's dry, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to reinforce those edge hinges that we made. They probably are going to be fine, but I like to just put extra hot glue in there just to be extra safe. Okay, one last little bit that I like to do before we pour plaster is these flying buttresses, fancy big word. Now there could be some distortion of the walls when the weight of the plaster starts to push against them. Foam core is pretty stiff, and this is pretty small, so this is probably overkill. But when I do a foam core mold that's a little bigger, I definitely want to put flying buttresses on the side. And that's basically these little stiffener pieces here like this that will help to support the walls and keep them from flexing out. Now, full disclosure, I usually will put a slightly bigger base on this so that I can make the buttresses a little longer. I'd like to have the buttress at least half the length of the wall so it really can support it. But this is small, and I just kind of want to show you the concept. I'm not going to worry too much about it because I don't think this is going to move that much. Okay, it's time to do some plaster. I use the Essential Guide for Mold Making and Slip Casting for all my plaster ratios. We will be using pottery plaster. It's great stuff, and I'm going to mix it with this squirrel mixer to get a very good, even blend of plaster. Okay, we are just about ready to mix and pour plaster. Now, before I do, and if you were looking in this mold and being like, wait a minute, look at that rough, icky edge on the clay there to the foam core, and the surface looks a little uneven. Don't worry about it. We're going to fix that later in the plaster when we flip this over. I definitely am aware of it. I'm seeing it. I don't worry about it. Now, that's just the way that I do it. There are some people that like to really just finesse and get this absolutely perfect. That's just not the way that I do it. There is no wrong way to make a mold. If in the end you end up with a mold that casts great, then you did it the right way. So this is not the definitive way. You don't have to follow me exactly. But I personally, in my studio, find it's easier to mess with that stuff after the fact. And I'll show you. Now, before I pour this, I'm going to actually tape this down onto my vibrating table to vibrate this while I pour the plaster to make sure that there are no air bubbles. Again, you don't have to do that in your studio. You can just knock your table to vibrate it. You don't need a fancy vibrating table. But I've got one, so we're going to use it. There is nothing wrong with your monitor. That is the vibrating table that is shaking, and that's why it looks a little weird. Now, I'm going right into this plaster. If you want to go deep into mixing plaster and all of that magic, I'll put a link at the end of this video to one of my more in-depth mold making videos. Now, once I get this thing topped off, I go back and I give it a quick spritz with some rubbing alcohol to break the surface tension at the top of the plaster and pop any surface bubbles. Okay, that was side one of two, and it is lunchtime. Now, before I dash off to lunch, I'm just gonna keep an eyeball on this for a couple of minutes to make sure that there's not a sudden drop in the level of plaster. Now, small molds, you're gonna be pretty safe from massive plaster disasters. Hashtag plaster disaster, search for it on Instagram. It's an exciting hashtag to follow, along with hashtag ceramic casualties. That's another one that's a lot of fun. If you ever want to feel good about making mistakes in your studio, it's always nice to look at other people making mistakes to realize we are all human and we're all learning. At any rate, there's not a lot of hydraulic pressure here, and there's not a big void for this plaster to zoom in onto the bottom of this. So I think we're okay. And visually, I'm inspecting it. I don't see any leaks. So I think that we're safe to go to lunch. Now, I'm going to let this cure. It's going to do a chemical process where this plaster will go from liquid to solid. It's going to take about 30 to 45 minutes. Now, I will know it's safe to flip this over once it is heat its peak temperature. This is an exothermic reaction, big science word, which means that it gives off heat during its chemical reaction, turning from liquid to solid. It's still not at its peak strength when it's hot, so I like to let it get cool. You want to let it start to on the cooling cycle before you put any real stress onto the plaster. So we're gonna let that happen. We're gonna flip it. We're gonna clean it up like I promised and pour the second half. All right, we're back from lunch and it's in the cooling phase, which means we can open it up. Okay, it takes a little bit of elbow grease, if you will, to get the foam core off. But once that is off, the clay comes off really easily. It's soaked up a lot of heat, and the heat makes it soft after that exothermic reaction. Once the clay is off, I take a little steel tool, and I very carefully cut away that rough edge. Remember I said I wasn't worrying about the rough edge before? Because I knew I'd be fixing it right now. We've got the surface clean. I took it to the sink and washed it with a toothbrush to get all the remaining clay off of the surface of the plaster. Now, remember I said before, I wasn't too worried about making this glass smooth back when we were putting the clay wall down, because we're gonna do it now, and we're gonna use this. It is a type of a metal kidney. This is like made out of a very thin spring steel, and I'm going to use it to scrape back the surface of this plaster and get it really nice and smooth. Okay, I think it's done. Is it perfect? No, but it's pretty darn good. We always strive for perfection, but we can never truly attain it. Now, why am I putting so much time into this? Because this is the time you want to put into making molds. You want these things to be very clean. You want them to join together well. And if you don't put in time now, you'll be putting in time later every single time you have to open this mold or cast this mold. Your investment in time now will pay off in dividends in the future, trust me. So now that we've got the wall nice and clean and flat and looking fantastic, we need to talk about keys and pry points. For this, I will be using some round keys, and I'm going to use a router bit very carefully with my little handheld drill to put some keys in here. Now I'm going to put in 3 keys. I'm going to put in 2 on one side and 1 on the other, and I think we're good to go. I marked the location of the keys with a Sharpie before I started drilling, and it's critical when you do this to go very, very slowly. I found that you get a nice clean cut if you just have the drill motor going in a low speed and just kind of ease your way into the plaster. We're going to cut another set of foam core walls, and so I'm using a measuring square and a piece of wood once again to find a height. I'm looking for about 1 inch off, so I think 3 and a quarter. Let's go 3.5. I'll do it. 3.5 looks good. Hey, it is Henrik from the future. Well, I mean, I guess I'm editing what you're watching now, so I'm from your past, but let's not focus on that. What we do need to focus on is I forgot to film myself putting mold release on that first plaster half. Right after I drilled those keys, I went and put 3 coats of the Murphy's oil soap onto that. I put on a coat, I buffed it all away, I put on another coat, buffed it all away, and put on a 3rd coat and buffed it all away, and waited till the plaster had a nice glossy sheen. It should look like like a piece of glass almost once you've got all the oil packed in there. That's how you know you've got it well released and you're ready to pour plaster on top of plaster without having it stick. Okay, I've got my parts cut and I cut a new base. You don't need the base. I'm just gonna use it because I wanna have something to hot glue this to. Like I said, you don't necessarily need it, but it's good just in case there's a leak, and also I can tape it down to my vibrating table. Now, plaster, believe it or not, expands a little bit when it's going through its chemical reaction, and then it shrinks back for like the next day, it'll shrink back. So it's a little bigger than the 4.5 by 5 inches. So you can see there's a bit of a gap. That's fine with me. I'm just going to really squeeze this on here and glue it together. And then we will sand back any irregularities between the two halves. It'll all be fine. Don't sweat the tiny stuff like this. We just want to make sure it doesn't leak. Now, just like before, I'm going to go ahead and run hot glue up these cut corners to just as an extra sealant, and I'm also going to run a bead around the base just in case. I mean, it's very unlikely the plaster will find its way down there, but better safe than sad. As always, we want to avoid those hashtag plaster disasters. Alrighty, there we go. I'm going to grab the vibrating table and we'll mix up the second batch of plaster for the next half. This is cruising along. Oh, I almost forgot the buttresses. Plug the gun back in. Again, probably not necessary for a mold this size, but I feel compelled. Definitely not necessary if you're pouring silicone, but plaster has a higher specific gravity. It's heavier stuff, so it can really push on your mold walls. All right, now we're ready. As always, with plaster, wear a respirator. So when mixing plaster, I carefully measure out the amount using a digital scale, and you want to just gently add the plaster to the water. You want to let it really soak up. Once I've got the plaster in the water, I'm going to let that slake or soak in the water for a good 2 minutes before I mix. After the 2 minutes have passed, I then mix for a solid minute, and I time it to make sure I don't go over or under this. And then it's time to pour. You want to just carefully pour it in a slow and steady stream, starting at the lowest point in your mold until you've reached the top of your mold walls. Okay, we're just going to keep an eye on this for a little bit. The plaster is going to kind of snake its way down. There's a small gap sometimes between the foam core and the first mold half. So I'm just going to keep an eye on this, hopefully. My fear is that the tape is going to lift off and it will go into the coin slot on this thing. I mean, if that happens, that's okay. I just want to be here to add a little bit more plaster to fill it in. Now, you might be noticing that I mixed up way more plaster than I'm going to use. That's because I have found for me that if I mix a very small amount of plaster, I have a hard time getting a good mix. I have a hard time getting, it just doesn't flow as nicely as when I mix. So the smallest amount of plaster I usually like to mix is like, I use about I think I used what did I use? Just 1.5 quarts of water. And I think it did 4.5 pounds of plaster. Now that's just for me. Some people make smaller batches and that's cool. I just don't like it for me. The quality of the mold is more important, so I want my plaster to mix well, to flow well, to not have bubbles. So this is the way I do it. Again, you don't have to do it this way. Just do it whatever way works for you. This looks pretty good. All right, it's been like 40 minutes or so. It's just starting to get warm, so it's just about to begin that, ready for the big word, exothermic reaction. And I think we're just gonna let it do its thing until tomorrow. I'm gonna leave this overnight so it can go through its full heating and curing cycle, and it'll be cool tomorrow morning. So I'm gonna pop in here tomorrow morning. We're going to cast a bunch of little Lammy mugs, and we'll try to crack this thing open as I wake up, bright and early. So we will see you tomorrow morning, and let's all just hope that this opens up okay. Okay, it's 6:10 in the morning. I am about to pour a round of little ammies. Hopefully I will wake up while I pour them, and then we can open it up. All right, it is time to see if we can open that mold. Here we go. All right, pretty good so far. We can see the plaster poured down just a little bit there. So I'm gonna use a metal kidney. Just kind of flake that away. Because we put mold soap on the lower half, it doesn't stick. Well, at least, hopefully it doesn't stick. Not only do I use the kidney to scrape away that kind of extra overflow of plaster, I then go around all the sides of the mold with the flat edge of the scraper to get everything just nice, smooth, and square before we commit to the next big step of the process. All right, the sides are clean. It's time to open it. Now, this is the most stressful part of the entire operation. I will usually put pry points into the mold where I can insert a prying tool, just like this one. This is called a split ring plier. This is called a split ring plier, and it's an automotive tool. And when you put a pry point into your mold, you could insert this into the pry point and pop open your mold. It's fantastic. Why didn't I do one? Because I totally forgot. It happens, and it's something that I usually just automatically do. I can't believe I forgot it. It's probably because I was filming this video, but I'm not too worried. What we're gonna do is very carefully use small little shims like this, and we're just gonna tap, tap, tap into the seam line. I've also got some plastic shims that we're gonna try, and I have a rubber mallet. I'm not too worried about chipping the very edge here along the seam line because I know that we are going to bevel it. Here's the old mold, and you can see how I beveled that. So I'll be beveling away any area that I might chew up trying to pop open this mold. The other thing that kind of freaks me out is the piece inside of here is rigid, which means that it doesn't have a lot of flexibility. When I mold, say, a mug sculpture, the clay inside is soft, and it gives me a little bit of wiggle room when I lift that plaster away. There's gonna be no wiggle room here. Let's just go for it. You're gonna see what happens. If this is a sad, sad day, you're gonna see it on film. Now, where am I putting the chisel in? You can see there is a very faint line, so that's how I can tell where the two halves of the plaster are. You'll usually see a little something that'll show you where to start working on the mold. And sometimes I like to just give some gentle taps. This lets the mold know that we're going to try to open it. And I sometimes like to think that this unseats the plaster. I don't know. There's a lot of superstition in mold making. Again, this is a rubber mallet and I am not hitting very hard. Okay, here we go. Okay, so just a couple of taps, and look at that. You can see that it has started to separate on this side. Now, instead of just going bonkers and splitting that side open, I want to flip to the other side and work that side too. I want to do this uniformly. I don't want to pry it one way like that because the model inside that little toy is rigid, and the mold is not designed to open this way. It's designed to open this way. So we want it to come straight up so I don't break anything. So far, so good. Success! Well, success so far. We got one side open. You can see the plaster gripped around this key a little bit. I'm not too worried about it. That's a good cast. Ho ho ho! We did it! We did it! So what is up with these little chips around the keys that we drilled? Well, it just so happens that when I do these, I like to put a little extra layer of release around the edge of the keys. I found that round keys can sometimes stick at the edge, so I put just a little coating of Vaseline to be extra certain that the plaster will not grab. Before we move on to the next step, I'm going to carefully chip away those little extra bits of plaster that chipped off from one side onto the other. Just like forgetting to put the pry points on the mold. I can't believe I forgot to put that little extra mold release on these keys. It's kind of just what happens when you're filming yourself working. You forget little things because you're thinking about camera placement and whatnot. I'm not gonna beat myself up about it. This mold will still work perfectly. In fact, this exact same thing happened to me on the old mold. So you think I would have remembered, but like I said, this mold will still cast completely fine. Once I get this cleaned up, it won't matter. This will still register. Of course, the little perfectionist in me will still see this little bit of mold with a little chip in it, but I think it'll be okay. Once I got the plaster cleaned up, it was time to hit the sink with some hot water, a gentle toothbrush, and some dishwashing soap to clean out every last bit of the clay that we used to build the walls and just any icky, yucky stuff that's in the mold before we make our master silicone mold. Okay, we got the molds clean and they look great, but I want to go in now and add that bevel. Right now this mold has very sharp edges, and while they might be pretty, sharp edges tend to chip, just like this corner right here. And we don't want any chipping when we're doing slip casting because plaster bits, when they get into your ceramic bits, will explode in the kiln. So we want to make sure that these are difficult to chip, and we avoid chips by beveling the edges. So here you can see the other mold that I use. This is the old mold, and see all these edges are beveled? That means I can put them on a table. If I set it down on a table and the edge goes first, it's very unlikely to chip. So we're gonna go through and carefully bevel all of these edges. I've got 4 minutes left before I gotta flip the mold. So I might flip those molds and then we're gonna bevel these edges. I'm so glad that this opened up. And this is just super quick. This is a good time to talk about, again, the little key mistake. So I forgot to put pry points in, and I forgot to put extra release on these keys. I usually put a little bit of Vaseline. It's okay. These are not critical flaws. There are critical flaws in mold making, and there are flaws that are just slightly aesthetic. These keys will still register great. There's still a huge, deep, round key here, so all of these keys are still gonna work fine. It's okay. Now, if I had opened this up and say there's a giant air bubble in the actual casting surface, that would be a bigger issue. That would be something I'd be really sad about. The issues that I'm having right now, they're not that big. They're not big issues. They're just my little perfectionist issues. Molds are flipped. First thing we're gonna do is the corners. So I'm closing the mold up and I'm going to use a Sure Form. This is like a woodworking tool, and I'm going to just hit these corners. Now I'm working over the trash can to capture all of the dust. And I'm gonna be I start by putting a 45-degree bevel on the corners. See what we're going on there? Now, it's up to me how far I wanna go. I just have to keep in mind, I don't wanna go so far that I hit one of the keys on the inside. So I'm gonna take this just a little bit farther, and then I'm gonna match that on all of the 3 other corners. Okay, I've got all 4 corners cut. Now, this is how you decide, do you wanna be extra fancy or just somewhat fancy? Now this is somewhat fancy, and I love being somewhat fancy, but sometimes I wanna be extra fancy. I think I'm going to completely round off these corners. So I'm gonna do 2 things. One, I'm gonna go back with the Sure Form and just kind of do my best to round this out. And then we're gonna go to the sink with some drywall sandpaper, and we're gonna completely round out these edges. Just because we're gonna be extra fancy today to make up for my mistake on the keys. Don't worry about getting it perfect because we'll be using a sandpaper to get a nice round corner, but you get the idea. This drywall sanding paper is magic for sanding plaster. I mean, that's really what it's for. And it just makes short work of just smoothing out all the edges on your plaster molds. All right, now that we've got the edges rounded, I'm going to take a fettling knife. This is like a ceramic tool it's made for carving plaster and clay, I guess. And I'm gonna go around on the inside and I wanna bevel the inner edge of what will be the pour spout for this mold. Right now it's kind of jagged and yucky. We wanna get a nice bevel on there. Let's just go for it. Once I had a smooth bevel on the pour spout, I opened the mold up and added the bevel to the inside edge of the mold. I'm using the fettling knife here, and I'm only going to do the inside edge. I'm not going to be doing the outside edge just yet. You'll see there's a reason for this. And also at this point, I want to mention that I have got a plaster trap in the drain of my sink. Do not put plaster bits down your sink unless you've got a plaster trap. Trust me, you will thank me later for this important tip. Alrighty, it is the afternoon. We had to, finish the casting for the morning, and then we had to open all those molds. We had to seam all of those little ammies, and now I am back here with, ta-da-da, a finished, fantastic little mold. So we have done it. We have made a little mold, and when you think about it, this really only took a day. In fact, it would have taken not even a full day if I didn't have to videotape the process of making this mold. That always adds a little bit of time. And it is a pretty darn good mold. This is ready to go. If I wanted to right now, I could just jump into casting with this. Now, there is mold soap on this, so if you are a studio potter person and you want to go ahead and just start slip casting with one of these, you are welcome to do so, but you want to get the mold soap off of here. And to do that, just give it a scrub down with vinegar. Scrub it with vinegar, rinse it with soap and water, rinse it with water, scrub it again with vinegar, rinse it with water. You should be good to go. I, though, do not want to jump into casting with this because this is my only mold. Now, you remember we're making this as a replacement for the last one, so I know I'll only get about 70 castings out of this before it breaks down and I need another one. I do not want to have to spend a day making a whole nother mold, so what I want to do is make a silicone mold of this mold so I can make more molds. Now, I think I should check in with future Henrik, who is editing this, and ask, do we have time to do the silicone mold right now in this episode? We're kind of at like 30 minutes right now. I don't know if we've got time for silicone today. Yeah, but I mean, don't you think we kind of need that finale, that closure of a silicone mold? I guess it would give it some closure, but can you do it quickly? I promise I can do it quickly. We're not going to get into details. If people want details, they can go and watch the How to Make Silicone Production Molds episode. We're just going to quickly box this and pour it. Would that work? Yeah, we're going to need this to be pretty snappy, okay? Because I want people to watch this whole video. Yes, okay. Let's do it. Okay, first things first, I'm going to be making a mold box. I'm going to be making a wooden box, a plywood box that will hold the silicone and keep it from distorting when I pour the silicone in here. And when I'm pouring plaster, when I'm casting stuff with this, I'm trying to go quickly because I'm worried that you've been watching this for a long time and I don't want this to be too much for you to handle. But I do want you to see how these molds are made. Again, if you want to look at this in detail, go back to one of my previous episodes on making production silicone molds for slip casting. But anyway, we got our box dimensions here. Now, I happen to have a whole bunch of boxes back in the studio of older molds, and I'm hoping that I can find one close to this size that will fit. I specifically need a height that is 2.5 inches. So let's see if we can find one back there in the pile of old molds. So when I retire a mold, I like to keep all of the plywood boxes because I can recycle them for just this purpose. They can always be used to make more molds after their life is done on that first edition. Okay, I can't believe that I have these. These are fantastic. They're from the Dead Bastard mug. So we're going to be using these, and the lengths are fine. I needed something that was going to be 12 inches, and these are, it looks like they're about 13. So I don't mind if they're just a little longer. Let's just quickly double check. Oh my gosh. So they're 12 and a half, so that's perfect. And these are a little long though, so I'm gonna have to take these out and cut them down to be 6.5 inches. Fantastic. So I'm gonna make that cut. We have to then, yeah, I'm just gonna make that cut and I think we're ready to go. Okay, there you go. Now, this looks fantastic to me. This is a bit of a wide edge. If I wanted to really conserve silicone, I probably could go a little thinner than this, but I plan on getting many, many years of use out of this mold. This glaze tester is something that I plan on using until I retire from slip casting. So I don't mind making this silicone mold a little extra beefy. With that being said, I'm going to cut a foam core base. I'm gonna hot glue this thing down and we're gonna start mixing up some silicone. Okay, I am gonna put a layer of mold soap onto these, just a very thin layer. It's debatable whether or not you need to add any release. Technically, the silicone should not stick to the plaster, but I like to, the surface of plaster is just very slightly porous, so I just like to put just one pass of mold soap on here, just as a safety. Like I said, there's a lot of superstitions in mold making. Technically, I don't think it's necessary, but it's just something I do. After releasing the parts, I hot glued them down to a piece of foam core and hot glued the plywood mold box down to a piece of foam core. And then as a final step, I'm going to cover my clay table with some table paper to make sure that the silicone doesn't get all over everything, because it is messy stuff. This is a critical step. Always check to make sure your table is level, and don't just check one way, check both ways, because you want the top of your silicone pour to be completely flush with this mold box that we spent so much time making. Well, we didn't spend that much time making this one. Sorry, I'm out of breath. I had to run back to the house to get the level. Whew. Yeah, this is a critical step. I mean, we're going quick, trying to go fast with this, but do not skip this step. Once I knew the table was level, it was time to mix and pour that silicone. Now, I am rushing this, and I have done a very in-depth video on how to mix this stuff, what kind of silicone I use, why I use it, and I'll put a link to that at the end of this video. Once again, I'm just trying to get this done in one episode instead of breaking this up into a silicone episode and a plaster episode. Hope you don't mind, and like I said, if you want to go in-depth into this, please feel free to follow the links at the end of this video. Alrighty, it's in, and it looks really good. You can see why I'm crazy about leveling the table, because I want this silicone to be right up to the edge of the plywood, because we're going to be flipping this over when we use it. You may have noticed those up arrows down there and that they're upside down. That's because when we use this mold, this is actually the bottom of the mold that we're looking at right now. The top is on the facing the table at the moment. So we're going to let this set overnight. The silicone cures rather quickly. It's probably already thickening, but it won't be ready to demold until tomorrow morning. So we will come back then. It is Friday morning. We just poured slip and the silicone has fully cured. So that means I'm going to pop this open and then we will be at the end of our mold making journey. Before I pop this open, I'm going to trim the back of it and I'm going to do one other very important thing. First up, we carefully trim away the edges of the silicone. We're beveling the silicone just like we beveled the plaster. Now, we're not doing this because the silicone may chip. We're doing this because it makes it a lot easier to seat it into the plywood mold box. After we do one side, we flip the mold, pry off all of that foam core, and trim the back as well, although this is actually the top. This is the most critical step. I'm putting a little notch here. This notch is not going to affect the casting in any way, but it's going to let me know how to put the silicone back into the plywood jacket correctly. Once I take the silicone out, I could put it back in the opposite direction, and it might distort the mold a little bit. So I put a notch in the silicone, and I put a marking on the plywood to make sure that this mold always goes back together the same way. The final bevel is put around the actual mold pieces itself. Now, this is why we didn't put an inner bevel on these mold tops. If we had done that, it would make it very difficult. This edge of silicone would be leaning over the mold. It just wouldn't look clean. So what we do is we put this bevel like this, which makes it easy to get the plaster in and out of the silicone mold, and we will add that final bevel to the plaster once we cast the fresh molds. Okay, it's time to open this up. I'm going to actually remove 2 of the screws that hold this frame together. That'll give me a little bit more wiggle room. All right, and so now this is what I'm talking about. Now we just have this frame, and we, thank goodness, wrote which way is up, so we know what the top of the mold is, and we put this little notch in there so we know how to orientate the silicone when we put back in, because if we hadn't put those on there, we could just put it in upside down and reversed, and it would be a nightmare. So that's why we think ahead. I'm gonna let you see it before I see it. One. I hope it looks okay. Two. Ah, they look fantastic. Now, this little kind of white film that you see, that is the mold soap, I believe, or whatever. Don't worry about it. We're gonna take it to the sink, we're gonna scrub it out, and it's gonna look fantastic. All right, a scrub brush and some dish soap is completely cleaned out the mold, and now you can see the little marked notch doing its job, helping us to orientate the silicone into the plywood jacket. Okay, we got to pause for just a brief minute while I look at YouTube and try to figure out if, for the first time ever, now that I'm approaching, gulp, 10,000 subscribers, I think I'm going to attempt to put an end card on this video. I think I can do it. I'm gonna watch some videos and see if I can figure this out before we wrap up this video. Will I succeed? We'll find out in a couple of minutes if there is an actual end card on this. Okay, and here we are. We've done it. We have made a plaster mold of a simple plastic toy, and then we have made a silicone master mold of this plaster mold so that I can cast as many molds as I need. If I drop this mold, that's fine. I can make another one. If I want to make 10 castings in a day, that's fine, because I can cast 10 molds from this and cast 10 castings. Now, this episode is a bit rushed, and it's not because I was desperate to get an episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday done, which I always am, but I'm actually desperate to do some testing with this little glaze tester. And I'm not testing glazes, I'm testing different colors of porcelain for an upcoming project, and therefore I needed a new mold for each type of porcelain that I'm testing, because I'm concerned about the porcelain either staining or contaminating the mold and affecting my tests. So I only had one glaze tester mold. It was tired, it was breaking down, but I definitely needed more for the tests that are coming up. So that's why this whole system happened, and I am extremely excited about it. I will be using this for years. Now, like I said, I rushed it because my edit, beep beep, my porcelain is arriving next week, and I need to start casting as soon as possible. Now, since this was rushed, I have done some great videos that go in depth on both how to make the plaster and how to make the silicone masters. I am going to put those links here, and feel free to click on them. And I have also done several other videos in the Tiki Technical Tuesday series that go deep into mold making. Just look for mold making through the playlists, you'll see them. But anyway, there are the links. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe if you haven't. It means a lot to me, and we are getting so close to 10,000 followers. I'm gonna do something very special for the 10,000th episode. I think I'd like to do a giveaway. So anyway, click subscribe, because only subscribers will win the prize. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday.